Seth. And I walk up and I say, I need to get some food. And I walk towards the restaurant, which sits right over the pool. And I think to myself, it's been a decade, but I'm pretty sure, as you mentioned when we were just talking in the corridor, you're very, very famous. So I was pretty sure that's Piers Morgan. And then I just was brave enough to venture. Do you remember me, Piers? And you did, because
I did.
A decade ago, you remember the dirty tricks you played on me at CNN.
Well, I just remember you getting very wound up. You were easy to wind up.
Well, let's do now, if we can, I'm going to bring in a couple of first responders, nurses, fire department, police, because I know you're pro-vaccine mandate, who've lost their jobs today, and I want you to be able to have this debate with me in front of the people that suffer from your policies.
That's fine, but I'm not actually pro-vaccine mandates, with one exception. I did believe that it was relevant for people who worked in healthcare. That was I thought that was the only part of it which I thought was justified, because I felt if you're working in hospital conditions, you're already taking a number of other things as part of your employment, other vaccines and so on. So I didn't feel that was unreasonable. I did feel that wider vaccine mandates were unreasonable. And I think that throughout the pandemic, the one thing I've tried to avoid is being dogmatic and sticking to a position when facts obviously change, whether that's about masks, whether it's about the vaccine efficacy and how that works in terms of transmission and so on. And I think one of the problems with society today is that everybody gets boxed into their partisan tribe, and then they don't care about new facts emerging. And that, to me, is going to be a central part of my new show, which is to try to bring the tribes together to understand that the most important thing is actually a fact. And as Ben Shapiro rightly said, facts don't care about your feelings, and they shouldn't care about your tribalism either, because that's where you end up where we are today, with the most fractured, polarizing society imaginable.
So if I may, whether or not you have been dogmatic in the past, you've certainly been emphatic when it comes to masks, when it becomes a conversation about vaccines, as you pointed out. I think you said something like 25,000 or 125,000 UK health workers shouldn't be in healthcare if they won't get the vaccine.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that your position on those issues has changed as the facts have changed?
Yes, because I think what the most important fact to me about the vaccines, and when I said that I felt there should be a mandate against health workers, for example, that was at a time when we didn't really understand the full reality of the transmission impact of having the vaccine or not. What is clear is that the vaccines have been very effective. They prevented a lot of serious illness and death. But the ability to transmit the virus has not been stopped by vaccines. And although you have a higher ability to transmit it if you're unvaccinated, you don't have no ability if you are vaccinated. So my position about that did evolve because I saw the facts change. Like so much of the pandemic, everyone was blind to start with, and everyone took blind positions. And I've tried, actually, as I've got older and perhaps a little bit wiser and more experienced, to understand that being too entrenched into a position too early when things are uncertain is always a mistake. And I think that that's what I'm going to try and certainly do going forward. I think the pandemic brought the best out of many people. It also brought out the very worst in people.
Piers, I want to tell you personally, I truly appreciate what you're saying. If it's absolutely true that your evolution has been one because the facts have changed, that is a noble place in which to situate your intellect and your public position. I wonder, do you feel propagandized? What I mean is, and I'll be real with you, Piers, I think to some extent you participated in that propaganda with how emphatic you were towards what you called the anti-vaxxers. And we saw, as you saw, the information change from 100% efficacy to 90% to 60%. I believe the last we heard when it came to the J&J shot was 12% efficacy on stopping transmission. I will agree with you. It does seem to have some scientific backing that it does help with the severity of the illness.
Well, that's inarguable. You can't argue that. If you're going to be intellectually honest with me, you cannot sit there and argue these vaccines have not been highly effective in preventing death. And, you can move to the lockdown debate, for example. I supported the initial lockdown in the UK because I could see that we had no vaccine and no apparent hope of getting one, remember, at the start. I could see that people were dropping dead in places like Italy, which had magnificently good healthcare systems, dropping dead in mass numbers. We had no drugs to treat it. It was completely uncertain. We had no idea what we were dealing with. It was a terrifying few weeks in the first stage of the pandemic. I didn't see, and I don't see now, any other way in that moment to try and control and stem the amount of death without a lockdown. Now, there are clear side effects to a lockdown. One was massive economic upheaval. That was obvious, and we all knew what we were going to be signing up to with that. And the second, which was far less forgivable, was the massive impact onto people suffering from other illnesses. And for that, I blame ill-prepared governments. So there's no way that people who had, for example, cancer symptoms should have been ignored, even in that first wave, but they were. So the secondary death toll caused by the lockdowns was clearly, in my view, outrageous and unacceptable. But that doesn't mean the lockdowns themselves were ineffective. They were brutal, blunt instrument and effective. But again, coming to my point about changing my mind as facts change, once you get vaccines that work, once you get drug therapeutics which work, once you're not seeing, for instance, now more people in Britain are getting Omicron, the new variant, than at any stage of the entire pandemic, but far fewer are dying because of the efficacy of the vaccines and because of the drugs. So my position has changed. I wouldn't want another lockdown. There's no need to have one. The downsides of the lockdown are far outweighed now by reality. So I've tried to change my position depending on new facts. But I would defy you to go back and find anything I've said throughout the pandemic in real time with the facts that were known at the time, which was completely outrageous, because I don't think it was.
Well, I'll give you one example that I think was outrageous. When you said footballers, for example, soccer players, as this airs in the United States of America, should be denied medical care if they choose not to have the vaccine. So you expanded, and when you make a statement like that, Piers, when you take a position like that, it defies the third party, in this case me, reading that statement, thinking what you truly care about is health.
Okay.
If you truly care about health,
I'm about to give you something.
How could you say footballers should be denied medical care?
I'm about to give you something. When I said that, I was angry at what I perceived to be, and I still perceive to be, by the way, a selfishness that ran through the ranks of a lot of people refusing to get vaccinated. A selfishness because there was a much higher likelihood then that they may end up in hospital, putting a drain on the health systems, which were already under huge pressure. So I don't make any apology for feeling bad towards the anti-vaxxers, many of whom were being spewed with total propaganda online and believing a lot of nonsense about the vaccines and so on. However, I did accept the argument. Well, if you take that, Piers, as your position, what about chain smokers, right? What about drug addicts?
What about obesity?
About alcoholics? I accept that argument. And because of that, actually, I wouldn't now say what I said then. I thought the argument against what I said was right, and it was valid, and actually my concern for health workers, many of whom I know people who work in the health system who are under enormous pressure, in my effort to support them and to not want them overrun, I said something which, when I calmed down and when the argument was put to me about other people who I might perceive to be selfish with their personal behaviour, it's the same argument. So either you have a blanket ban on anybody who does something which is, self-abusive, never getting medical treatment, or you retract what you said. So here's your scoop. I'll take back what I said.
Again, I appreciate that about you. When we spoke in private, I believe it was in Daytona, I told you that I appreciate a lot of things about you, despite the dirty tricks you've played on me, which we'll get to a little bit later in the show, because there is an element of unpredictability, and I do believe earnestness to your positions. You called for intellectual honesty from me.
Yeah.
Here is the intellectual honesty. I do believe the vaccines have reduced the severity of illness and the potential for death. You said to me, the facts are obvious, and that's just stating not just an intellectual integrity, but reality. Yeah. What I would say is my position on COVID has been one of humility, as I think you are moving towards. Yeah. Because what we've seen over the past 2 years is how little we have known. How little we have known about the vaccine's effectiveness, how little we have known about the side effects and cannot even discuss, how little we have known about the effectiveness of lockdowns, how little we can discuss the effectiveness of masks. And what I feel like, and I pointed to your statements as an example of hammer and nail on this, which you retract, I feel like we have been propagandized to a level where we cannot have open discussions about things of matter of science.
I don't disagree with you.
And I would have to think to some extent that you have changed your positions. You have to feel a bit propagandized.
Look, I know you want me to say I'm feel propagandized. If it makes you feel better, I'm happy to say it. I don't feel like it because as a journalist, I don't come at this from left or right, you see. I'm not a left or right.
Well, let's just put that aside.
Person.
I don't think I am either. I think we're coming at a position from curiosity or conclusion.
I come from a position of being a journalist. So I try and work around what the facts appear to be. What's been fascinating about the pandemic is you look at someone like Dr. Fauci, for example, who's become increasingly unpopular the more he's appeared on the airwaves, but mainly because he's spoken with such certainty throughout the pandemic, and then facts have overtaken and made him look ridiculous. Mask efficacy, for example, at the start of the pandemic, you're saying you don't need them. Now, apparently, they're absolutely mandatory, when in fact, I think there are serious question marks.
I think we're going back the other way now, by the way. I think there's some admissions that cloth masks don't work, surgical masks.
And these are important debates to have, because if people want to get back to normal life, using masks seems to be increasingly irrelevant. And certainly in the UK, we've now got rid of all restrictions, and I support that. So I'm not, I don't want to be blindly self-righteous about this. And I have had moments in the pandemic, probably through working ferociously hard, seeing the appalling effect on the healthcare system in the UK, for example, getting emotionally entangled in it. I'd say it's more an emotional pressure I've felt than propagandizing. I haven't really taken other people's word for why I should think things. I've just seen hospitals getting run over, thousands of people dying a day, healthcare workers getting killed in large numbers in the UK. 400-500 health workers died in the early stages through lack of PPE, personal equipment. And I felt very strongly for that. So I think that it's been more of an emotional reaction. And I listen, when I watch, let me give an example. When I watched Will Smith clock Chris Rock the other day, I actually wrote a column not so much defending him as trying to explain it. And also, I think, making an omission, which the polls seem to suggest the majority, small majority, but a majority of Americans agree with, which is he was defending his wife against what he perceived to be an ugly slur about her alopecia. Chris Rock apparently didn't know she had alopecia, so it was just a joke about her having a shaved head and G.I. Jane, and therefore didn't deserve anything of the reaction he got. But in the moment, Will Smith lost his head. Emotionally, but for the right reasons. He believed this was an attack on his wife and her medical illness. I'm not equating the two, but what I would say is when I saw health workers dying in large numbers through lack of government support on personal protective equipment, when I saw care homes erupting with COVID and seeing 20, 30,000 elderly, vulnerable people, as we saw in New York, by the way, dying because COVID was allowed to let rip through care homes, when I saw the chronically useless testing systems that we had in place, despite having pandemic exercises many years before, I got very angry about what I saw as government failures to do this. And so a lot of my responses, I guess, were driven not by propaganda, but by emotion, certainly not by government propaganda. In fact, the opposite. I was the one in Britain taking them on. So I don't think I was propagandized, but I was probably a little over-emotional. And I'm not sure I even make an apology for that. And I'm sure we'll come to the debate about guns, which I know you and I differ about. And again, I would say I've often been driven by emotion on that, but I make no apology because the things I've been talking about at the time, be it Sandy Hook or others, are deeply emotional things, which if you're not emotional about it, there's something wrong with you.
I kind of like the admission that at times you're suggesting you can be driven by emotion. I do not think, by the way, in the limited amount that we know each other, but over a long period of time, you are strictly an emotionalist. You think your way through things, but you're owning the fact that at times emotion plays a role in everyone's life.
At times I've been wrong about stuff.
And I appreciate that.
And I think it's very important to admit that.
Yes.
One of the reasons I like Joe Rogan, for example, and one of the reasons I was so incensed by the effort to cancel him from Spotify, is that Joe Rogan, to me, is a brilliant interviewer because he's curious. He doesn't come at it from a partisan position. In fact, he's a Bernie Sanders fan, but gets boxed in as sort of alt-right by intellectually stupid people. He doesn't mind admitting mistakes, doesn't mind evolving his opinions. There's a lot to learn from Joe Rogan. It's why he's so popular. It's why my kids love listening to him. So if you ask me what's the game plan, well, be more like Joe Rogan, and albeit you're going to get people still want to cancel you because they totally misunderstand what he's about. But I do think that there's an intellectual honesty to Joe Rogan, which I find really admirable. And I think any interviewer, any broadcaster could do a lot worse than listening to his shows and understanding how he goes about his business. He doesn't want to prove a partisan point. He just wants to ask the right questions and get the right answers.
So I disagree with you about Will Smith, and I read your column in defense of Will Smith, and I hear you making the argument that people, men in particular, or men sometimes are driven by emotion, and it defies rationality. What I saw in that moment...
If I trashed your wife in a bar...
Yeah.
you'd whack me.
Yes, I would.
That's my point. So,
but here's my point.
Honest or dishonest about it.
But here's
actually,
my point.
Most men I know, if they believed someone was mocking their wife's medical condition, which had caused her, by her own publicly stated interviews about it for 4 years, deep emotional trauma, they would, I think, try and defend it. That was my only point. I wasn't defending.
But here's the
whack.
rebuttal and why I disagree with you. You doing that in a bar to my wife is highly different than Chris Rock doing that on the stage of the Oscars.
I don't think it's worse, Chris Rock.
No, because there's a tacit admission that when you are in that environment, you are in front of a comedian and you will be the butt of jokes. And it has been that way for decades.
Hang on.
And Will Smith, as a very famous person, knows exactly
I have one question
the nature of the relationship.
There's one fundamental point there. If Chris Rock knew that she had alopecia and he made that joke, and I've asked Ricky Gervais and others about this, and they agree, if he knew that she had this medical condition and he made the joke mocking her medical condition, that's crossing a line. If he
Ricky Gervais admitted that? He said that would be crossing a line?
Yeah, he said to me...
Ricky Gervais seems to have no lines.
No. He said to me he wouldn't have done that joke if that was the pretext to it, right? But he didn't think he should be hit for it, and he would certainly defend a comedian's right to, everything's a joke, right? But I do think that a lot of comedians I know wouldn't have made a joke mocking a woman's medical condition. Now,
but Piers...
here's the point, though. Chris Rock has made it clear through friends, hasn't said it himself yet. I want to see if he does. It made it clear he didn't know about her condition. If he didn't know about her condition, it was a harmless joke, and the reaction was ludicrously over the top.
Piers, you have a new show coming up on Fox Nation, Uncensored, in which you take on woke culture. Yeah. I would suggest to you that this particular issue, Will Smith versus Chris Rock, is an example of the tyranny of woke culture, but not in the way that you see it, actually in the opposite. When you point to alopecia as the trump card in this relationship, I feel like you're playing the game of the hierarchy of victimhood. Who is the biggest victim in this scenario? Is it Chris Rock, who actually is a victim of assault? Is it Will Smith, whose ego was clearly bruised? Or is it Jada Pinkett Smith, who has alopecia?
It's all of them.
What I would suggest to you is what we saw take place. Hold on. What we saw take place had nothing to do with alopecia and had nothing to do with the joke. I believe what we saw was not an act of chivalry. I think what we saw was an act of a bruised ego from Will Smith.
How do you know?
I don't know, but neither do you.
So admit you
but
don't
neither
know.
do you.
No, I don't mind the monologue, but admit you don't know.
I've managed to get in a few words in this podcast. I have to get them all out at once. No, I don't know, but neither do you. But I do know what the public reports are about their relationship, both who is in control and the openness of that relationship. And I think any man would have difficulty. His ego would have difficulty and be on fragile ground in a relationship like that. And I think what we saw in that moment was Will Smith in defense of Will Smith.
I don't agree. And here's why. I interviewed Jada Pinkett Smith at CNN many years ago. And Will Smith turned up unannounced and sat in the audience of him. And before we got going, he came over to me and said, Mr. Morgan, don't upset my wife. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. This was a guy who loves his wife with crazy passion. We know their backstory. She's always said that he came along. She said it to me that day. He came along and saved this rough diamond from a really hellish life that she was leading. And he made her grow again. And he nurtured her and he protected her. But crucially, she said, he protects me. He makes me feel safe. And I think you've got a passionate, hot-headed relationship with both of them. We know a lot of the details. We don't really know all the answers, but we know it sounds a little bit crazy, their relationship. But they're still together, and they're wildly in love, and it's volatile. And I think in that moment, he was probably worked up about winning his first ever Best Actor award. He's sitting there, and he's watching this guy who buried his wife at the Oscars 5 years ago when Chris Rock hosted the Oscars. He buried Jada Pinkett Smith in quite a mean way at the time. I don't blame that humour. That's fine. He didn't mock her medical condition. He just said she wasn't a big enough star to be there, right? So he knew that in the back of his head, and he just turned. And although you see Jada Pinkett Smith apparently laugh at something Chris Rock later says, in the moment you see her hurt face. And that's when I think Will Smith looks at her, suddenly thinks, God damn, he's mocking her alopecia. It's what I think happened. Like you, I don't know. But because of my experience of interviewing her with him in the background and what he said to me, I did a column not defending the act, which I felt was wrong and shouldn't have happened. Violence is never the answer. But I asked my wife, for example, back in London with our 10-year-old daughter, I said, if that had been us and I'd done that, what would you think? And she said, I just said to our daughter, we were just watching it early morning in the UK, and she said, I just said to her, Daddy would have done exactly the same thing. But violence is never the answer.
Okay, I want to follow up on the introduction to the conversation you made regarding emotion, the role of emotion both societally and you as an individual. I do think as well that emotion has driven most decision making from the masses over the past 2 years. And I think the propaganda on COVID played to our emotion. I'm curious what you think about this. I think we have been taken over. We have almost two competing. No, I retract that. We have one single emotion that seems to be driving every current event, popular narrative. And that emotion is fear. Fear of cancellation, fear of COVID, fear of everything. It seems to me that emotion has been placed as our primary engine as individuals and as society. And that one singular emotion is fear.
But you keep talking about the propaganda as if it's one way. I would throw back at you, there's been lots of propaganda the other way. A lot of people are now dead because they believe propaganda about the vaccines, for example. It's inarguable. I've tweeted the stories every time they've happened with their absolutely distraught family saying he was so anti-vax because of something he read online, that they kill more people than they save. People have believed propaganda the other way. So I don't mind taking propaganda lectures from you, but you have to accept it's worked both ways. And
do you think it's equal playing field, random posters on Facebook and government entities?
I think that the propaganda you're talking about has been over-safe, over-controlling. I think that it's led to other issues, like I said, with the economy, with other health issues, and you can certainly make a coherent argument for that. But I'd rather, in a way, that society was overcautious for something like an unknown new virus and pandemic than to be undercautious and for the death toll to have been 2 or 3 times what it has been. There is no doubt in my mind that these vaccines have saved millions, if not tens of millions of lives. And if you want to look at what's happening in Hong Kong right now, again, inarguable. In Hong Kong, they tried to operate a zero COVID strategy. Early on, I'm not afraid to admit, I thought that was a smart move. New Zealand did the same. Australia the same. China the same. It seemed a sensible thing to try and stop the virus ripping through. But that only works if you then vaccinate all the elderly, vulnerable people. In Hong Kong, they haven't vaccinated millions and millions of over 80s. And as a result, the Omicron variant, both types, has been killing large numbers of elderly people in Hong Kong. That is a shameful dereliction.
And in fact,
of
you can't
duty by the
find
government.
You can't find actually a model society. You can't find a model governmental approach because
I agree.
Bottom line is, it's a raging virus that we cannot control.
I agree. But I do think the propaganda's worked both sides. The only difference is the propaganda, which has skewed more to my position on this through the pandemic, has been intended to save lives, whereas I would say the propaganda promoting anti-vax mentality has actually cost a lot of lives.
There is this underlying current in what you're talking about on erring the side of safety that I think puts you a little bit at odds. You can tell me where I'm wrong. Puts you a little bit at odds with sort of your current moral crusade, which is against woke culture, against cancellation, because those who would oppose you would say you are putting people in unsafe environments. Not unlike Jada Pinkett Smith. You feel hurt, offended, emotionally disturbed. How do you distinguish these two?
Free speech should be a sacred platform on any democracy. I should have the right, as you and I are expressing strongly held opinions here, which we disagree about a lot of stuff, about a pandemic, for example. That's how it should be in a democratic society. And afterwards, you and I can go for a beer. And we know that, right? We're not going to take this personally. But if I discovered that your wife had a medical condition and I suddenly began taunting you or your wife by name about that medical condition, this would turn nasty pretty quickly. You wouldn't be thinking, I've got a right to free speech and I have a right. That's not wokery. That is somebody being deliberately malicious and cruel about someone's medical condition. So I don't really accept the argument that flies in the face of my position. My position generally is, for example, the reason I left ITV in the UK was because I took a position watching Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's interview with Oprah Winfrey that Meghan Markle was lying, that a number of things she was saying I knew in real time to be untrue. This allegation that her son wasn't going to be a prince because of his skin colour, I knew was absolutely cast iron a lie. It wasn't true. But it's a very dangerous lie because it propagated the myth that the royal family is racist, and that was why they were doing it. So I got incensed by what I saw as a deliberate hit job on the royal family and the monarchy, who I respect enormously. They're not perfect. We know that from the outrageous conduct of Prince Andrew, for example. But they are something which I believe adds a lot to society in the UK, and I'm a big monarchist. Watching this deluded American actress coming into the royal family and then tarnishing them all as a bunch of callous racists, I found unforgivable and outrageous, particularly when Prince Philip was seriously ill and, in fact, soon afterwards died. So I wanted to express an honestly held opinion. I didn't believe a word she was saying. I still believe that. It's honestly what I think. I don't believe a word she says. But I was told I couldn't have that opinion, even though everybody else on the show that day disagreed with me vehemently. So there was proper democracy at work. I wasn't allowed to be the one to say I don't believe it, even though we knew a lot of the things she said were untrue. So I was in the farcical position of being told, well, either apologise or you lose your job. So I said, why would I apologise? So I took the option of leaving my job. A job, by the way, which had been fantastically successful. We trebled the ratings in 5 years. It was the most talked about morning show in the country. We finally beat the BBC, which everyone told me would be impossible. We had the hottest show on TV. And I was levered out of that. And it turned out the real reason was Meghan Markle had the night before contacted the chief executive of ITV and demanded she fire me. And used phrases like,
is that right?
Used phrases like, we're both women and we're both mothers. You got to get rid of him. I mean, it was vomit making. So Meghan Markle thought she had the right to cancel me for disbelieving her. And one of the more satisfying things about my reincarnation now at Fox Nation here and with this new global show is the irritation it will bring to Meghan Markle, Princess Pinocchio, as I call her, back in her California mansion, who thinks she has the right to suppress genuine free speech.
Was that a transformational moment for you in your career, or have you always been a fierce defender, not just of free speech, but against this effort to define us by race, define us by gender, define us by our identity?
I hate that. I hate all identity politics. I think it's so lazy and cheap, and it's being used by people all the time now as a protective shield to legitimate criticism. You see sports stars using it. You see royals doing it. You see politicians doing it. The victimhood has become the new virus of society, almost as lethal as coronavirus. You know, people think there's a premium in being a victim now. There's no merit in being strong. You're not allowed to say you're mentally resilient or strong. It's offensive. You have to be weak. You have to be mentally fragile. Then people will celebrate you. You have to quit in sport, not be Rocky Balboa, who gets up and carries on and fights through to the end. If you quit after the first blow, you're now a hero and you win awards. You know, and to me, it's absolutely nuts the way society's gone. So I want to be someone who celebrates free speech, what it really means, which is what Churchill said about it, which is free speech at its heart really is not about whether you listen to somebody who you agree with. It's about listening to someone you don't agree with, respecting their right to have a different opinion and tolerating that other opinion. Unless they're nasty racists or they're genuinely transphobic or homophobic or hateful people who are engendering a spirit of danger.
But the problem is, Piers, that unless you just said carried all the weight, because your opponents would expand the definition of transphobic and racist to essentially include everything.
Well, that's what they try and do, and that's where you have to be very clear intellectually about where the line is. For example, it is patently not transphobic to say that Leah Thomas, the swimmer who was a male swimmer, is now a female swimmer, smashing women's records, causing irrevocable damage to the integrity of women's sport. It's not transphobic to say that is patently unfair. But that's the way that anyone that raises their head over the parapet in that debate is immediately branded. That, again, is lazy and it's intellectually dishonest. I support trans rights to equality. I believe in equality for everybody. Everyone should be entitled to fairness and equality. But there's nothing fair or equal about trans athletes competing against women who are born to inferior, in terms of power and strength, female biological bodies. And to frame the narrative, if you're concerned about that, you're transphobic, particularly for people like me who've been on the record supporting trans rights to equality, is lazy and shameful.
I agree. Do you think we should, as a society, accommodate the demands of a trans person's identity when it comes to their pronouns? Should you, or is it transphobic if you do not, refer to the pronoun as requested?
I think people should be entitled to call themselves whatever they like in a free society, but we shouldn't be compelled to use any pronouns.
I agree.
I think the idea that people get removed from Twitter because they don't, I mean, here's what I'd say, that there's a sort of grey area. And I'm not entirely sure what I think about where the line is. But if somebody repeatedly goes after a trans person on social media, deliberately calling them a man, for example, if they're a trans woman. If they do that repeatedly and repeatedly use he pronouns and so on to taunt them and torment them, I don't think that's acceptable. But I don't think you and I should be compelled to use pronouns that people come up with for themselves, because apart from anything else, there are more and more of them. And for instance, with gender identity, the BBC's been teaching 9 to 12-year-olds there are over 100 genders. One of them is astrogender, which is an affinity with the stars and the galaxy. I mean, sorry, it's complete bullshit. So the idea that I would have to refer to this, whoever this astrogender person is, as, you know, Astra or something, forget it. But if you want to call yourself Astra, good luck to you. But society shouldn't change all its language to accommodate this out-of-control woke nonsense. And the example I was talking about this earlier, about when you have the Washington Post talking about pregnant people. What are you talking about, pregnant people? You and I can't get pregnant. Doesn't matter how many donuts I eat, right? I'm not going to be pregnant. Women get pregnant. And so who decided women can't be used anymore for people who are pregnant? They're called women. And this eradication of women's rights to be addressed accordingly, to be addressed correctly, is to me a really insidious part of what's going on in this so-called progressive politics, because it's not progressive, it's regressive.
What do you think of the fight in Florida where Disney has now taken a position over whether or not kindergarten through third graders should be able to be spoken to about sexual identity and gender identity? I
think it's pathetically weak of Disney. Their original position of we're not going to get involved in politics was the correct and admirable one. Although, of course, the reason they took that position, I suspect, was it means they don't have to take a position about the Uyghur Muslims in China, where they have billions of box office takings there until the moment they support the Uyghur Muslims, in which case it would all be yanked. So there's a moral cowardice to Disney's supposed concern about this. They're also now streaming to all these countries where it's illegal to be gay, for example. Again, there's a moral cowardice and hypocrisy there. I think that they've also deliberately, and again, the woke left have deliberately ratcheted up this to be, you're not allowed to mention the word gay, you're not allowed to be gay. That's not what I've seen in that bill. So it's a misrepresentation of what it is. As a parent of 4 kids, I don't particularly want kids to be, educated formally about sexualized stuff or about gender identities, particularly when the gender debate is so out of control. I don't want them exposed to all that. My daughter's 10 and probably reaching the age now where you can start thinking about conversations like that. But that's the kind of conversation before that age that parents should be having with their kids if they want to. And the moment you take on parents' rights as to what their kids can and cannot be taught, you end up with the situation you saw in Virginia. You do it at your peril, because most people do not share the woke view about this. They don't. So I think Disney's made a very cowardly mistake in bowing to the woke mob in their ranks, ignoring, I would imagine, a lot of conservative people who are Disney employees who've been presumably shamed into silence. A few of them have been breaking ranks, talking about how stupid it is. But again, there's a moral bankruptcy at the heart of it, which is they want to carry on making money streaming to anti-gay countries. They want to carry on, having box office hits in a country which is oppressing Uyghur Muslims. They just want to make a little virtue signaling play down in Florida. It's to me, gutless.
Okay, so we've been covering some ground that we agree on. I want to save 5 minutes to talk to you about guns, and we can keep it to 5 minutes. Sure. But first, I want to go on a bit of a monologue because I want to see what you have to say to this. And I truly bring this to you with a sense of curiosity. Okay. I believe, Piers, I don't know if you have evolved, but you've begun to sound out the idea that someone's sense of personal safety, my sense of individual dignity or offense, does not give me the right to shut down your thoughts or your speech, nor does it allow me to shut you out of society, i.e. canceled. You have seen the tyranny in that sense of emotion. Yep. I do sense a bit of inconsistency in you when we take it back to our conversation about COVID. And I don't want to get into the specifics of the vaccine again. What I'm talking about is your instinct in that moment is to err on the side of safety in where you would say someone, and for the record, not that it matters, I'm vaccinated, as is my wife. Right. But I do not think someone should be called an anti-vaxxer, i.e. transphobic, i.e. racist, if they exist outside the bounds of the acceptable narrative. because you believe safety is so important. Now, I don't know that I've heard you call necessarily for cancellation or the shutting down of speech, or to the extent that you have, you regret it when it comes to COVID. But to me, the through line on all of these issues is a small minority using their safety as an excuse to shut down free thought and free speech. And I feel like you stop just short of seeing that through line on all of these issues. You've seen it on woke issues, you've seen it on race issues, you've seen it on trans issues, but you were at times an enforcer of it on COVID issues.
Yeah, but again, I come back to propaganda as a two-way street. You see my positions on COVID has been driven by propaganda. I see them as trying to be a journalist, getting to the facts and responding accordingly, albeit sometimes emotionally. But I think there's been way more propaganda the other way. And when I say anti-vaxxers, I'm not talking about people who have a respectful position of, you know, I just don't want to do this for X, Y, Z.
Or
reason.
recognizing a natural immunity, running the risk-reward ratio with your own health conditions.
All those arguments, right? All those arguments. Or people who have health issues why they shouldn't be taking one. It's not about them. It's about the people who've been aggressively anti the vaccines. You've been marching around with placards spewing lies about the efficacy of vaccines. Those people have cost lives. And I make absolutely no apology for branding them anti-vaxxers, because they have been, by their own admission, anti-vaxxers. And I think they've been very dangerous in a pandemic. Because, as you say, you've had it. Your wife's had it, your family's had it, you want to be safe for your family. Same with me and my family. And I find the aggressive anti-vaxxers believing propaganda or promoting themselves have been very dangerous.
To be clear, my children haven't had it, and I won't chase it with never-ending boosters either.
Right.
Okay, let's take this full circle. So Piers and I laughed at the beginning of the conversation, for those of you that might not know. And this is going to tie in. Full circle, we can bring this conversation with a ribbon on top about the role of emotion. So really, the first time I met you, Piers, was you invited me, or one of your bookers, because I'm sure it was beneath you, to book me directly
I wouldn't have booked you.
onto
below my pay grade.
panel on CNN on gun control.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to have what ended up being a debate between you and Ben Shapiro, a debate with Piers Morgan. I show up, and I'm at a town hall. There's probably 100 people in the audience, which, by the way, I'm seated in the audience, not on the stage to debate you literally on equal ground. I am beneath you.
You were a secondary booking.
In the audience.
You're not going to get any airtime at all.
Well, there was nobody on equal ground who was holding my position. And the entire crowd of 100 people around me were the victims, the families of victims of gun violence.
Yep.
Sandy Hook, Gabrielle Gifford, Arizona shooting. Piers, dirty trick.
Really? Really?
Talk about an appeal to emotion.
Well, you could feel-
Talk about, well, you've admitted it,
Let me throw back
letting
again.
emotion drive your
Let me explain to you.
conversation.
It's not a dirty trick to be confronted with victims of gun violence when your answer, from memory, your answer was to buy into this, in my view, absolutely ridiculous position that the only answer to gun violence is more guns. The answer from the hard right has always been, oh yeah, the obvious answer to mass shootings is to have more people have guns. Then it wouldn't happen. Coming from a country like the UK, like I said, we have a massive cultural divide over this. We just don't really have any guns in the UK. We don't get any shootings. Certainly the last mass shooting was many, many years ago. And as a result of the last mass shooting in Dunblane in Scotland, for example, we changed our gun laws irrevocably. And as a result, gun violence has gone down even further, same in Australia. So there's, I think, a legitimate argument to be put from countries which have no real gun violence to look at America's gun violence and gun ownership and gun culture and ask pertinent questions. Now, you asked me if I changed my position on one thing. I would never again have a debate with an American gun lover, gun owner, whatever you want to call yourselves, about gun control. I would change the whole debate, because the most reasonable conversations I've had with Americans about this have been where I've used the phrase gun safety. And I've always felt the word control was the problem. That actually, especially from a snotty Brit like me, coming from a country with no guns, trying to tell Americans how to lead their lives, it was a non-starter. It was never going to work. And I think all I did was help sell more guns. So it was a completely self-defeating campaign for me to tell you, give up your guns, or have the government seize your guns, or whatever it may be. I do think there are legitimate arguments to be had and a proper debate to be had amongst the vast majority of Americans who own guns, who I believe are reasonable people, to have a reasonable debate about how you reduce the level of gun violence, the level of gun deaths, by bringing in more reasonable measures of gun safety. And I do think if the debate was framed that way, we'd all get a lot further about reducing the number of people getting killed. That's it.
And you and I could have an hour-long debate on gun control, as you and Ben Shapiro could have an hour-long debate on gun safety.
Yeah.
The thing I wanted to ask you about today was this. Looking back at some of the clips from 2011 or 12 or whenever those debates took place, there was essentially a twofold debate that you were taking part in. One was the particular danger of the AR-15 and its functionality as separated from a handgun. I want to set that aside. The other is the understanding of the purpose of the Second Amendment. And you did mock the idea that the purpose of the Second Amendment was to potentially oppose a tyrannical government. You found that absurd. I'm just curious.
Well, only because the United States government now has 5,500 nuclear weapons.
Right.
It has mass armed military at its disposal. So if actually you believe that you could turn against your tyrannical government, if the government genuinely became tyrannical, it would be able to kill everybody.
That's exactly the point I wanted to take up with you, though, today. You are a fierce defender of Ukraine. You are an absolute advocate for helping Ukraine stand up against the Russians. Piers, the first thing the Ukrainians did was hand out AK-47s to the civilian population.
Sure.
The first thing they did is attempt to arm their population.
Sure.
Afghanistan has withstood the attack of not one but two superpowers in this world.
Yep.
The United States of America and the Soviet Union through a very committed, small arms-driven military. And I think that when you look at those two historical examples, and in particular your position on Ukraine, doesn't it make you have to revisit the idea that, in fact, a well-armed public is an insurance policy against a tyrannical government?
85 people will be shot dead in America today, or die at the hands of guns, including suicide. 85 will be tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after. 500-600 people a week, every week in America, get shot dead, either through their own volition or by somebody else through murder. And I think that's an unacceptable level of death. And I think most reasonable people in America...
But to be fair, Piers, you also think that well over, I believe, approaching 1,500 civilian deaths in Ukraine in a month's time frame is an unacceptable level of death.
Ukraine has been invaded, right? You're suggesting a proposition where the United States of America gets invaded.
But they're invaded by a nuclear power with all the same characteristics you described with the American government.
Right. Well, there is a higher likelihood of Vladimir Putin one day wanting to invade America if America's response to his criminal invasion of a sovereign democratic country is not to engage with him. That is what I'd throw back at you.
And I would say there's a higher likelihood...
I'm very surprised to hear the right in America, who've always been fearless defenders of freedom and democracy, happy to sit back and watch this genocide happen on an hourly basis and continue to play a weak position of we can't do anything because he might nuke us. And it's a weak position. And I would throw back at you the double standard. It flies against what you're talking about, right? Which is that actually he's a tyrannical regime out of control, invading sovereign countries. America is the biggest superpower in the world. NATO, including America, has the biggest military force in the world, including its own massive nuclear arsenal. We're letting this guy commit genocide. Why does the conservative right in America feel comfortable about sitting back and letting him do it? Why doesn't it recognize the danger of a marauding, out-of-control dictator? At what point do you get involved, as we did in 1939 with Adolf Hitler? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I can't speak for the American right. What I would suggest to you is I think after 20-plus years of war and carrying the flag of freedom for the whole entire globe, that America has a right to ask specifically these two questions. What is America's direct national interest and at what cost?
Yeah.
On the side of at what cost comes American blood, treasure, lives, and potential nuclear war.
Yeah.
That's all I think that's being
you're
asked.
talking
I think that's all it's being asked here.
You raise a question to me about how I could watch the people of Ukraine take up arms to repel Putin, this nuclear power. And you also said that one of the reasons why Americans believe they need to be armed against a potentially tyrannical regime. And that's fine. But what if the tyrannical regime is Vladimir Putin, who feels emboldened by the lack of action from America and NATO.
Well, then I will
allies,
say that
right?
Vladimir
and
Putin...
decides he wants to invade the United States. Right?
Well, I would say he's going to have a hell of a fight on his hands in Texas.
He might, although very worrying, very, very worrying.
I mean, if you're going to... Let me tell you something. They don't have to hand out guns in Texas. We already got them.
He would in Texas, but he wouldn't, judging by that poll about the number of Democrats who'd leave the country.
And that's embarrassing.
I mean,
that's an absolutely embarrassing
poll.
poll.
Shocking. In the United States of America, that so many Democrats would leave the country rather than fight for their country.
It's a shame. It's an absolute shame.
But look,
listen.
Let me ask you finally
Sure.
about this guns thing, because I've thought carefully about how to best effect proper change, which doesn't infringe on what an American believes their rights to be under the Second Amendment. Although I would argue, as I used to argue at CNN, the definition of a Second Amendment has evolved over the years, inarguably. I mean, you can go back and chart the history of its interpretation, and it's moved to effectively allowing people now, if they want to arm themselves like Rambo in this country and say that that is the interpretation of the Second Amendment. Never used to be like that. So we can argue about that, and it's pointless because you're not going to want to hear it from me or my accent, and I get that. I'm a Brit abroad, and I'm not an American citizen. So I respect the right. I believe in the Constitution, actually. And actually, I'm covered by it. As a British citizen, when I'm in America, I'm also covered by the First Amendment, for example, which I take very seriously. In fact, when I was talking about guns at CNN, there was a petition to have me deported, led by that crackpot Alex Jones, and Barack Obama saved me, pointing out that I had my First Amendment rights to talk about the Second Amendment. And I saw that you, as a
I signed that petition. I signed that petition.
Yeah, but you would also be. Yeah. So what you, by signing that petition, that's interesting. By signing
I didn't.
Petition,
you know that's not true.
You would have been thwarting my First Amendment rights. You would have been deliberately going against the Constitution of your own country.
Yeah, you know that I didn't do that. Let me say this. To wrap up this conversation, you have many more duties today here at Fox. We're both at a better place than we were 10 years ago.
Yes.
I'm happy that you're here. I truly mean that. I find you wonderfully inconsistent, and I find you wonderfully unpredictable. And I have, for some reason...
I prefer the second one. I don't like to be predictable.
For some reason, Piers, despite playing dirty tricks on me, I've always found you impishly charming, and I certainly have enjoyed our debates to the extent we've had on and off camera. So I hope we get to do more while you're here at Fox. I can genuinely say I'm happy that you're here at Fox.
And you know what? When Piers Morgan Uncensored launches on Fox Nation, come on the show.
I'm going to make sure I know what the circumstances... Before I say yes, I want to know exactly the details of the segment.
And who's in the audience.
Yes.
I've got 100 people that hate Will Cain to sit around you. No, listen, I've enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah.
I think it's been a robust exchange of views. I don't admit to being completely consistent about everything because life isn't that consistent about everything. I think I'm work in progress. I like to think my views evolve. I like to think I pursue changing facts and evolve my opinions, but sometimes I get that wrong, and sometimes there is a grey line, and you have to work out through interrogation and intellectual debate where that line should be. And I think I want to be part of that process. But overall, I want people to come on my show with all opinions. You haven't got to agree with me. You just have to respect my right to have a different opinion to yours. The fact that I'm normally right in our exchanges shouldn't put you off coming on.
I can promise you your ego is only matched by mine. So I'm happy to have this conversation more, man. Thank you.
All the best.